everyone, and welcome to York Festival of Ideas. My name is Kai Cao, and I'm the Equality and Diversity Coordinator at the University of York. I will be chairing the event this evening, and thank you for joining us. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce you to our speaker this evening, Dr. Anna Sulan Masing. Anna is an academic, poet, and journalist. She co-founded Sourced, a public research platform that explores our global food and drink systems, and is the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Cheese magazine. Anna's 10-part narrative podcast, Taste of Place, by Western Radio Collective, explores colonialism and nostalgia through the history of pepper. And her 2025 podcast, To Be Delicious, a cultural context of MSG in Britain by Lecker, looks at East and Southeast Asian racism, its diaspora, and the future of MSG and umami. It all sounds incredibly interesting. And this evening, we're going to find out more about her debut book, Chinese and Any Other Asian. Anna, over to you.
Thank you very much for having me this evening. I'm really excited to be here. So I'm going to read a little section from my book. It's the beginning of the arts and culture chapter. We are all Scarlett Johansson. This joke is old and boring, but it is forever funny. My friends and I still laugh about it years later. We have to. The idea that stories from East and Southeast Asia can be appropriated by Western media without consideration is part of the colonial dynamic we still live with. The joke is funny, but we are also living with it every day. We are here for consumption, every part of us. Our food, our culture, our bodies. The story that Johansson was inadvertently caught up in in 2017 was about whitewashing ESEA stories, inspiration without examination of power. It is, of course, not Johansson's fault, not really. She is a stand-in for the many white artists who had the option to choose other non-problematic roles, but didn't, or who are financially stable enough to turn down work, but again, chose not to. She's not the only person to have seen this wholly inappropriate casting decision and either failed to recognize its inappropriateness or failed to say anything about it. But the real issue at heart of this joke is the lack of ESEA stories being told in global North spaces by ESEA people. Storytelling is traditionally a way of explaining and passing on a culture and a set of belief systems to the next generation. It is a way to form identity, to create community and belonging. It is also a passing down of history and legacy, a way to remember and to reinforce culture. I often recall the Iban stories of my childhood that softly tell of multiple ways of looking at things, of banishing a binary and believing in the spirits in the trees. And I have told my own story in these pages. Storytelling for me is continuing heritage, and also making a mark on the world to say, I am here. It is a way to bear witness and to record our existence. To tell our stories is to show we matter. The stories we tell are crucial to our society. Whitewashing the original source of stories takes away the cultural context. Casting a white person as an East or Southeast Asian character or employing a white writer, producer, or director to tell an ESEA story means that people whose culture that story comes from are unable to see themselves and/or their heritage in a modern context. We are not able to see how we fit into the world we live in our stories if our stories are not allowed to be told in a way that makes sense to us, with our bodies telling our own stories. Part of the Scarlett Johansson conversation is about who can play what role. Because of the lack of parts for East and Southeast Asian actors, it is harmful to see roles that are steeped in East and Southeast Asian lore being played by white actors. And what does that say about how whiteness is valued in opposition to Asianness? All of this raises an important question about representation. What do I mean by representation, and what is good representation? Where can nuances be achieved? In the 2018 film Crazy Rich Asians, British-Malaysian actor Henry Golding's casting was pulled into question because of his mixed race identity. His whiteness was raised as a key issue. A main criticism for Golding was that he wasn't Chinese, yet he was playing a character written as a Chinese person in the original book. Coupled with the fact he is half white, his casting was seen as Hollywood being reluctant to cast a full Chinese or full Asian person as a romantic lead. It was his adjacency to whiteness that had gotten the role, critics said. Although I understand the idea of casting a non-Chinese actor as a Chinese character, that should be questioned. I also wonder how we define the correct face. Golding is half white, half Iban. Does he have to exist? Does he have to wait until a story is written about his exact mix before he is allowed to be on screen? There were other problems with this film. Singapore is an incredibly racially diverse country, yet the film depicted pretty much only Chinese Singaporeans, ignoring the Malay and Indian populations. But there were positives too. And does the commercial success of Crazy Rich Asians override the specifics of casting and cultural specificity and create change and inspiration? Is seeing faces like or similar to yours the key to becoming recognized and valued? I think it's a start. So as well as Scarlett Johansson, I am also Henry Golding. I think I'll stop there. I think we've got quite a lot we can dive into.
Certainly. Oh, thank you very much, Anna. And when we were having a bit of an email exchange about your book, we were talking about how we can actually speak to a lot of things in this conversation. But we decided on this particular part because there's such complexity of the question around representation. What sorts of stories are being represented? And what sorts of story that's being told in this kind of film industry? So I'm just wondering kind of your thoughts, perhaps thinking about representation, perhaps less so about, who gets to play what role, but maybe something around kind of what kind of stories being told. So can you share with us some of your kind of thoughts around storytelling, representation, and what might be missing in that sort of, the examples that you have given, for instance?
Yeah, of course. I think one of the things in this chapter, but throughout the book, is constantly thinking about the stories and the landscape and how East and Southeast Asian identity obviously fits within that cultural landscape. And as you say, stories is obviously the films, the books we read, the TV shows, but it's also things like the food that we have and values. Really hearing the stories by East and Southeast Asian writers and being able to kind of author our own identity within the space of Britain. And I think that's what's really missing. We have these stories that are written by other people, even if they are cast appropriately. And like this idea of representation is sort of a bit of a shallow or fallacy concept. I really want to question the idea of what do we mean by representation. As you say, like, it's not just to play what, it's about those told and why are they being told. And we've got stories like Miss Saigon, that's a story about Vietnam written by white men. And I guess that's where I'm really interested in exploring, is the idea of who is the author of these stories.
Yeah. And I suppose another thing that I've been thinking about when we discuss throughout your book, you have referred to this historical context, the cultural context of colonialism, and how that has an impact. And sometimes these bigger contexts can be overlooked, can it? So when we are looking at the film industry, we cannot ignore the Western kind of, how dominated it is in terms of Western popular culture in the storytelling, in the casting, in that whole process. But also, of course, we have a lot of talented actors who can play the roles, but actually, what sorts of stories are being told, but also what sorts of voices are being amplified by those actors? Thinking about, once the film is produced and is being broadcast, then the actors are also being put on stage to talk about these films. So whose voices are kind of given in order to speak for a particular community in which the story is being told? And I thought that's actually very interesting as well. And you mentioned about Golding's Iban heritage as well as yourself. And I can't help but think there are so many stories that's not being told from the community of indigenous people. And I'm kind of curious about perhaps your feeling around this, and as you're writing this book and as you're reflecting of the wider kind of popular culture. Yeah.
Yeah, it's obviously I have my little drum to bang, so to speak, in that like Indigenous stories are not really told at all. I mean, across kind of all indigeneity, I guess. And few people understand that there are Indigenous people within East and Southeast Asia. You're originally from Taiwan. Obviously, Taiwan has a, and so I think there's that nuance and that complication that gets really missed out. And with Henry Golding, I found it so interesting that the conversation around him and who he represented was a kind of general Asianness, and it was, and so he gets talked about as a kind of general Asian, because people don't really know what Iban is, and that nuance of his identity gets really missed out. And as my book says, it's Chinese and any other Asian, like, and those are the things we're allowed to tick. So even just at a bureaucracy level, we're already cutting out so many identities. I mean, just within the Chinese identity, there is so many kind of multiple identities in that. So even just the label Chinese is a made up concept. So I think that's really the kind of key and the nub of the whole question, is because we have, there's almost like a hierarchy of value when it comes to storytelling, that is very much through a Western lens, a lens of whiteness, as if we have to speak to a particular sensibility, and that obviously makes the audience like treats the audience as being stupid. And I think that the audience are a lot more, whatever the audience background, heritage, history, etc., are a lot smarter and are much more interested in complicated stories, I think.
Yeah. And one of the things I find, like you said, that sort of bureaucracy and the oversimplification to define ethnicity is extremely problematic, and how it's basically a social construct, isn't it? Because how do you really define ethnicity? And it's not simply by one's appearance. Although I think a lot of people's understanding usually is linking ethnicity to how one looks, and then they make assumptions about someone's identity. It's also often conflated with nationality, even though it's not strictly the case. And speaking of me having a Taiwanese heritage, in Taiwan, we have our own way of defining different ethnic groups, and certainly indigenous community is one of them. And I constantly think about when I was in Taiwan, I was so privileged with my ethnicity, having grandparents coming from a heritage basically from China. But then my grandmother and my mother are considered kind of more local and like Taiwanese born. And what do all these mean? And it still gives me the privilege that a lot of our indigenous communities do not have. But when we talk about being Taiwanese, there is a sense of identity that is quite strong. And kind of almost erase a lot of those complexities within, how rich the culture is with very different sorts of migration coming into Taiwan, now reshape its food and, particularly food culture and its arts. That sort of richness just really get blended out, which is such a shame. And we hate to kind of lose that sense of story, of how we understand our heritage very differently, but also how do we kind of work together in terms of moving forward, to make sure those nuances are being heard. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is, and that's what I mean by like, what are these stories that we're telling, and that everyone has to question that, right? Like, and everyone has to kind of think about what stories that they are promoting and what narratives they're promoting within their own lives and their kind of everydayness. I think like stories is an everydayness, and that we sort of forget about.
Yeah. And I'm really curious about the importance of story for you. And I'm asking that because I'm a kind of person who likes to talk to people. I'm very curious about, everyone's got very different backgrounds, life history, history of their families. I always find it quite fascinating how different we can be. And that difference is such a rich kind of property, maybe not like a property in a very hard sense, but actually just how I feel like it would be a shame if we missed out on these really interesting stories of people's lives. So I quite like interacting with people to get that sort of nuances. But I feel like that sort of narrative is often kind of missing, particularly when we look at the broader political landscape at the moment. It's quite easy to lump people into a category like, tick box, those sort of things. We've really missed out that sort of richness when we talk about culture and also say art, food, these sorts of things. So what is the importance of that story to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is going back to this idea of really it shows it bears witness to who we are, and like really why we need to be telling these stories, or like why we need to be talking about ourselves, and not just telling big stories, but why we need to be talking about ourselves in multiple places is because it bears witness, like we are real, our histories are real, like our heritage and our experiences and our life experiences, they're real, and people need to know about them and hear about them. And I think it's that and that's why I'm so interested in hearing stories. And you're saying you love talking to people and sort of this exchange of ideas, and I think that's what's important. And I think one of the things that we can forget about, and we think we are, by being not prioritized within the mainstream media, is that we forget that our stories and who we are is important. So I think it's that kind of trying to find those moments of being of telling the difficulties of our stories. Yeah, and I think that idea of privilege that you just spoke about is so interesting, because in different spaces there are such different privileges, and our identity within the UK is not just related to the UK, but also has these different identities within the rest of the world and when we travel. And I think that's quite an interesting intersection of looking at who we are as well and the stories that we tell.
Yeah, certainly. And it's really interesting because when I first saw your the title of your book is Chinese and Any Other Asia, and I'm just like, oh, I can really relate to that, because every time I need to answer the question of my ethnicity, whether that's part of the census or part of the university process, we collect equality data, I always have to tick other. And then maybe I will have the opportunity to fill in my ethnicity as I identify. Maybe I don't. And for me, it's just, I appreciate that in terms of ethnicity, self-defined, you can have such variety. You could potentially have hundreds of different options. And in the UK context, I think the category Chinese only came about in the past few years. I don't recall seeing it maybe 15 years ago when I first came to the UK. So it's also constantly shifting based on the broader understanding, I think, in the society of what these ethnicity means, and also what is the purpose of us accessing, collecting these sorts of data, isn't it? It's quite fascinating. But simply having to tick other Asia or other Asian always feels a little bit awkward or unsure. There's something that I feel a bit uncertain about, and I can't always articulate it, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't want to be negative or like I always want to try and find a way that sort of empowers us for sure. But there is the act of always ticking other
Mm.
when you're filling in forms is kind of an act of othering yourself. You're sort of having to purposefully, because there's no other option, to other, I am other. And that on an everyday, occurrence has a sort of detrimental effect on you because you're constantly reminded and reminding yourself that within the society that you live in, that we live in within the UK, you are other, not just other in terms of, in relationship to whiteness and power and privilege, but you are other also in your own community of East and Southeast Asia. And I think the history of these tick boxes are to do with the colonial relationship. So Chinese often refers to or is thought of or feels like a bit of a shortcut for people who have probably had a history or a kind of heritage with Hong Kong and China, which is a colonial relationship. And again, that obviously only puts a very specific idea of what Chinese means. I have a friend of mine who is in my book. She said she's from mainland China. And when she came to live in the UK, that's when she became Chinese. Because before that, she had her own complex identity, like you said, about, who you are in Taiwan. And then suddenly you come here and then she's now officially Chinese. And I think that that's such an interesting idea, right? Like
Yeah.
my kind of concept of who I am is very much related to being indigenous. And yet if East and Southeast Asia and identity is a very particular concept within the UK. So you're battling these ideas of bureaucracy. And bureaucracy, as you mentioned, like why do we have to tick these boxes? But they're of course they're our future. This is how governments, councils, everybody plans for things for housing to healthcare is understanding the makeup of the community. And if
Yeah.
we're not represented in the community, how are we supposed to be represented, when a pandemic happens and Filipino nurses are the largest, like percentage of nurses that are dying, and yet they have, no identification within bureaucracy. So it is a kind of like bureaucracy of violence, I think, in erasure.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I think that's the thing, isn't it? So at the university, we collect equality data, so we know, we can analyze things like equality pay gaps, those are the things. So we need to know the population within the institution in order to carry out analysis to know how we're doing in terms of pay, in terms of progression rates, these sorts of things. Meanwhile, we also need to be very careful about making massive assumptions about different people's experience. We need to make sure we also find a way to talk to people, to understand their experience from their perspective, to know how to do things differently and better for everyone. So that's the kind of, negotiation, perhaps, or exploration that we need to do. I am also paying attention to the Q&A part. So if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function, and I'll be able to collate them based on themes, and we can ask Anna to answer these questions. So while we are waiting for them to come in, I'm just going to ask Anna another question, which is your book itself have included a lot of different voices and stories from people who you've talked to. And what you said about not wanting to be too negative about this. And I'm just wondering if you have any stories that really impressed you in terms of how your friends really talk about um, their experience of otherness. I don't know whether that question sounds a bit vague. Personally, so as an example, personally, I know what I look like for a lot of British people, or actually for a lot of white people, white British people. They just assume that I'm not British. So sometimes I cheekily play that card and use it as a way of asking questions to challenge what is this story, for instance, or what is the background of this saying? What does that really mean? Does it have any implications? I do play that card sometimes because the way people make assumptions about me, which allow me to question some of the thinking in an English speaking context, to really play with that. So I'm just wondering if you have you've heard any stories from your friends that may be similar, almost like, can you be empowered by that sort of otherness somehow?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like, I think there's a really I think that although my book is, is a very serious topic, I think it's a very fun book. Um, and I think that that's important because one of the things when I was speaking to a lot of people is that there was a real ability to, take the piss out of themselves and see the funny side of things. And there's a real power in that, right? Like, as you say, play around with words, throw things back. And I was really, I had just the funniest conversations with people about how they responded and reacted. And there's been, and there's been a lot of kind of racial incidents that like get brought up within media, and particularly with around I talk about some racist incidents around marketing with restaurants and how stereotypes get performed, and how a lot of the people in the industry, in the community, sorry, reacted to that, and they were particularly industry people, and it was to send it up and make it funny. And there's this one woman, Mildred, who is so funny on TikTok and Instagram, and she just kind of played back this this restaurant who it's Ivy Asia, and obviously it's owned and founded and created by a very, very rich white man. And so she went around like sort of posing like taking the images of the marketing images and sort of replicating those poses as a sort of Chinese woman. And it was just so funny to see, these photos, these very glamorized photos of ambiguously racial women in the marketing, and her then taking up these strange poses that were obviously did not look like real things when you sort of a real person was doing it. And so there's loads of moments like that was just really funny, and there's loads of in jokes. And again, I think the Scarlett Johansson joke is a key one. Like, it's so old, it's so boring, but also it's really funny. Like when we're talking amongst ourselves, when something happens, we're like, oh yeah, well, I'll just be Scarlett Johansson, and things like that. So I really loved a lot of the humor that came out. I really loved a lot of the humor that came out. But also on that, I also found that so many people challenged me, and challenged my terminology. And I think you pointed out about when we were discussing this on email, like, I love Crazy Rich Asians. Like, I absolutely loved it. And then so I'm talking about how much I love it, but then I quote someone else later who's talking about how much Crazy Rich Asians kind of ruined the concept of Singapore. And and it's really important to have those contrasts, right? Like, we're not a monolith, and those kind of contradictions are not a contradiction to the wider story, that we need to have more ways of representing ourselves and more stories that can be told.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also what you said about humor, the way we play with this and explore different ideas, and the way we challenge each other it's also how we learn from each other. And I certainly really appreciate the different voices that come through in this book. Is, of course, people contradict themselves and also each other. That's the that's lived experience, isn't it? That's everydayness. And I think that is where that diversity comes through and is incredibly important. Thank you for sharing all of that. No, I know I was going to appreciate this conversation to kind of think about, how do we play around with ideas, particularly when it's such a serious topic. I think there is even more value about sometimes how we make fun of things and also find a way through these very difficult conversations sometimes. Anna, we've got a few questions that come through. So if that's okay, I'm just going to kind of start bringing them to your attention and we can answer that. So the first question is, how can non-Asian individuals show up to help change this and support our Asian friends? And I think this is particularly referring to our earlier conversation about that otherness that people tend to experience in the UK. So how do our allies show up to help change this?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think the key is like giving space for a nuanced conversation, and also giving space for different stories. And I guess within, thinking about, we're sort of in a slightly academic space in a way at the moment with being attached to the University of York. And one of the things that I've really found, and I've done a lot of conferences, and all of them have been, very, very different. And one of the, it's so simple, but it's understanding that spaces, particularly institutionalized spaces, have not been very welcoming or friendly or accessible to people of color in general, because obviously, and so thinking about how those spaces, and I really think institutional spaces is a really key aspect of this. How can people, marginalized identities, feel not just comfortable, but feel they belong in these institutionalized spaces? And sometimes that is so simple. It's about explaining to someone exactly how they can get to the correct building that they need to get to do their talk, or to be present in, or to attend an event. Like, this is how you get there. This is where it is. This is how it's signposted. So you don't end up wandering around a physical building that you feel you don't belong in. And sometimes it really is as simple as that, because the idea of like what a diverse, inclusive, and safe space is very different. A diverse space is a space that is full of different people. An inclusive space is a space where all those kind of different and diverse people are invited to speak. A safe space is where all those different and diverse people don't just feel invited to speak, they feel comfortable and to speak that without invitation, and not just without invitation, but they feel they can speak and be understood. Because so many times you're in a space and you have to not just say say your statement, say your idea, say your story. You then have to justify why your story or your opinion is valid. You have to give history on where that statement comes from. That doesn't whiteness or people in power don't have to do. They're already understood.
Yeah, thank you. And I remember, Anna, you wrote about this in your book as well. It really made me think a lot about how a lot of things by design is, for instance, by default, there may be a kind of particular Western colonial context to things that we take for granted. One of the examples that my friends talked about a while back is talking about those AI robots. If you picture those robots in your head, what is the color of those robots? Is it white? What does it look like? What sorts of intelligence are these things based on? Is it mostly Western-based, dominated sorts of knowledge and information? So there is a lot of things that is by design quite specific and exclusive of cultures that's probably being colonized, these sorts of things. So it takes some sort of unpacking and challenge for people to realize that actually these designs are not inclusive. We need to ask more questions about, how do we build a safer space for everyone in those spaces as well. So related to that question, and one of our audiences also asking, with the increasing popularity of different elements of Asian culture in the UK, such as K-drama, bubble tea, dictions that's been translated, do you feel like discussions of identity have shifted within the UK?
Oh, this is good. Yes, I mean I do. Of course, there is a growing interest, and people are so much more nuanced, and the different platforms where we can get our stories means that there are so many different types of stories. I guess one of the questions, or one of the things I'd think about, is interrogating again whose stories are being told, and understanding not necessarily who is in the room, or what stories we're getting, but also who isn't, and why aren't they there. So again, I'm going to beat my Southeast Asian drum again, but like there's very few Southeast Asian stories, or even when you see East and Southeast Asian festivals, like sometimes there's a real lack of voices from East and Southeast Asia. And so even within our community, I feel like it's a space that doesn't, an identity and a narrative that doesn't get spoken about or interrogated enough. And when we think about food, and we think about like what are the foods that are allowed to be fancy, what are the East and Southeast Asian foods that are allowed to be elevated? I hate that word, but like why do we still think that Malaysian food in all its iteration should be cheap? So I think there's that question of like what is it that is able to cross over, and not to think about, I definitely don't want to play off each other or anything like that. That's not what I mean, but rather thinking about like, oh, it's so great that we can understand a little bit more about like Korean foods and Korean culture and K-pop, and that's like amazing because that is so, such a bonus. But again, like what Korean stories are we hearing? What are the aspects that we're allowed, like, and is there a fetishization about some of these stories, because things, and again, cultures like Taiwanese culture, like whittled down to bubble tea, like that is the only point of culture that we're understand, like that's, and so with this kind of expansion, in a way, we also then get it also can become a fetishization or a simplification. Yeah, so I'm always just asking the question of like, kind of like, who isn't in the room, or what stories aren't in the room?
Yeah, I like how these different elements have come, so we can start a conversation about this. I think I saw boba or bubble tea. I feel like it's my cue because as a Taiwanese person, I feel very close to this particular drinks. But it's such a in Taiwan, it's such an everyday practice. It's people drink it like British people drink tea here. But in the UK, because of the kind of cost around it, it becomes such a delicacy almost. It's so expensive. So I always feel very conflicted about kind of, that's kind of a street food, but here it's, do I, take part in this or not? But I also miss it. But what I really like is actually now we have something we can talk about. And it's a great opportunity to actually talk to people about, actually, have you tried this? Oh, I've heard that it's from Taiwan. So what is it like in Taiwan? To start that sort of conversation, to really bring in different understandings of different cultures. And that's quite nice.
Absolutely. Like I think food, I think there's a fallacy of like food brings us together. I think that's a fallacy and can, like wash over like complications. But the great thing about like food and drink is that it can kickstart a conversation, and you can really kind of push people with that conversation without it feeling threatening. You know, not that you want to make everything comfy and cozy for people, but actually it's a really good like hook. And it's really and then people can feel included in the conversation, I think, which is really fun.
Yeah, definitely. I still remember the question that my friend was kind of asking, is curry British food? And depending how you look at it, is it appropriation or is it because the British colonial history that we should actually recognize that and acknowledge that sort of history and then consider, why isn't curry British food? So it brings a lot of that sort of discussions, debates, even for us to think about
Absolutely.
actually what is the reasoning of this thinking and why would they answer it one way or the other. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. We have another question. Is I can imagine this culture shock is felt strongly and subtly for international students coming to the UK. Are there ways that you think clubs, societies, and university staff can help better support students through this?
Oh, I don't know. I think there is a culture shock. I mean, oh God. I mean, you might be better at answering this question because I feel like I'm so distant from the universities now.
Well, and this is interesting because this made me kind of think about what was it that made me think about something that you wrote in your book as well, and that sort of having grew up imagining what Britain is, or being educated of how great Great Britain is. I think before I came to the UK, I also had some sort of imagination of how great United Kingdom is, and then come to the UK and then started to actually realize that I am Taiwanese, I am seen as a foreigner. This really kind of multitude of differences that comes in. To be honest, at the beginning, I kind of thrived with it. I like new stuff. I like experiencing new things. I threw myself into a completely different culture and just explored. I think it was not until a while later I then realized though there are loads of kind of blocks maybe for me to navigate, to figure out why am I being spoken to in a particular way. Is oh, your English is really good, really a compliment or a patronizing act. So yeah, like how do we better support students through this? Or how do we support anyone actually trying to navigate all sorts of differences that could be related to ethnicity, culture, class, even? I think in the UK, there's such a class difference, and particularly in the university, which is generally seen as quite elitist, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that question of classes is something that, is really important to discuss when we can't really talk about class unless we talk about race, and we can't really talk about race unless we talk about class. So I think that's a very good point. This is slightly off topic to the question, apologies, but it did make me think like one of the great things about food culture in the UK is that it gets really affected by international students. It always has. Like students eating has been such a cultural influence on food in the UK. And so it's been really interesting recently seeing the new Chinese restaurants that are growing up around all through the UK in response or because of different Chinese students coming to the UK than had previously been part of the university and student group. So that's really lovely. The reason we have probably more variety of Chinese foods at the moment in the UK is in restaurants is because of a new influx and a different group of Chinese students that are coming through, which is exciting. So I think yeah, I don't know how to support people, but I think you're right. It's about thinking about supporting kind of multiple identities and what that means.
Yeah, I personally feel like because I work at the university, and if this audience who raised the question, drop me an email, let's have a chat. I'm sure there are loads of ideas to make our environment and our practices much more inclusive to a lot of people moving forward. So timing wise, I think it's perfect. And now we have one last question from Naomi. How was the process of writing the book for you? Did one topic come to your mind first when you were writing?
Okay, so I have quite a process. This book was quite a process. I had a very clear idea of what I wanted the book to be. And I didn't really want to talk about myself because I don't really like doing that. And I wanted to have very clear, I wanted to have lots of different voices in the book. And to the point that I was like, at the end of each chapter, I wanted a different, a sort of a very short kind of maybe 800 words written by someone else. So that it was very clear that I wasn't being the voice of. Now, my publishers, my editors really pushed back on this and said, A, you need to be in this book. Your story is important. And this isn't an anthology. It's got to have a perspective, et cetera, et cetera. And she was absolutely correct. And it was very much my kind of like insecurity of like, I don't have the right to have this conversation and this discussion, even though so much of this was like, my PhD and to do with my PhD. I still didn't feel like I had a right to to exist in this world of kind of published author-ness. And then I had a very clear structure, which was quite almost chronological. There was one chapter on colonialism, there was one chapter on immigration and immigration policy. And anyway, once I wrote it all out, my editor was like, this structure doesn't work. And I absolutely agreed. And I had written it and I just knew that the book wasn't working and I didn't know what to do. So we ripped it all apart, literally had the whole book printed out. I just realized no one can see me, but I'm like gesturing in big hand movements basically printed out across the floor and cut the book up and moved it around and changed it to the chapter structure we have now. And I put the colonialism and immigration chapter into one chapter. So that's like 50% of work around that topic gone, which was really hard to do, but actually I think was incredibly important to really distill the key points. But it was, and we decided on a word count that it would be a short book. It was, it's only 50,000 words, or maybe it's about 60,000 words, 200 pages, because I wanted to really show that this wasn't the be all and end all. This was like a beginning and an invitation and a way to spark ideas. And so that people can go off and do their own research. But more importantly, there's so much space for people to commission more stories about East and Southeast Asian experiences and histories. So this very much had to feel like an invitation. And, like if this book does well, like, oh, hang on a second, people are interested in these stories, I will definitely, commission someone else to delve more into, for example, the history and understanding of East and Southeast Asian sex workers in the UK. Because, I touch on it because I talk about the films and how films represent the hypersexualization of women of Southeast Asia. But like there needs to be a whole book about that experience and that world, just as there needs to be a whole book about like the Taiwanese identity, which like I barely even mentioned because like how can I fit everybody in, that was so important that it was this kind of like pinpoint little light bulb moments to hopefully open up to more stories. But yeah, I really, the process was me writing and then me like ripping it all apart. I pretty much did the same with my PhD thesis. That at least I did. I rewrote something like 5 times because structurally it's getting that structure right so that people can understand it and follow the stories and the language. And then putting more of myself in it. After the first draft, we ripped it all apart and I did the second draft. And then my editor came back and was like, Anna, you've taken out all the fun bits. Like you're quite funny when you talk and you've taken out all the funny. And so that was also hard to then like sort of because I got really academic about it and sort of to re-put back into the sort of humor and the personal side of things. But it's really hard talking about yourself. And some of these histories are really, really upsetting to read. And then having to then read it, research it, hunt them down, then write them is really, it's really upsetting. So it was quite a hard process. Yeah, sorry, I've waffled on a lot there.
No, thank you so much. And I do feel like we're only just warming up to our discussion, I feel like, and we can easily continue this for a very, very long time. And I do apologize to our audience that we are not able to answer all the questions because unfortunately it's pretty much 9 o'clock. So I just want to say heartfelt thank you, Anna, for joining us to discuss such interesting, diverse topics that's being covered in your book. And thank you as well for answering so many questions from our audience and also from myself. Some are a bit vague from me. So I really appreciate that. And to everyone, thank you so much for attending today's event. And if you would like to purchase a copy of Anna's book, Chinese and Any Other Asian. Oh, it's bad. I'm sorry about that. The copies will be available from our partner bookseller, Foxlane Books, which is foxlanebooks.co.uk. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Anna.
Thanks so much. And it was such a pleasure to have a chat with you.
Thank you. It's great for me as well. Thank you.